Shalom and welcome to Contextual Bible Study. This is our third session together. My name is Denny Thompson, and this week we're going to take a look at Jerusalem. We're going to do an overview of the city of Jerusalem. And if you remember last week, I mentioned that Jerusalem sits right in the middle of the hill country, the Judean hills or Judean mountains. Now, as you can see by the picture, the city of Jerusalem sprawls throughout all these hills or mountains. It covers a large area. Of course, it was much smaller in Jesus' time. But the Bible says, as the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forevermore. And it kind of is a real visual what it looks like. I mentioned last week, way down there is the Jordan Valley. From Jerusalem going down, that's about over 4,000 feet, 4,300 feet. And over here is the Dead Sea, way in the distance. Now, here's kind of an overview of all the city and beyond. Way in the distance is the Judean wilderness. Notice the stark contrast, how quickly it goes into that very bleak-looking wilderness, desert. The Mount of Olives, kind of to the right over there, looks real light colored. We'll see why that isn't just a second. What's there? We'll look at that. We're going to look at the Temple Mount a little bit today and much more in detail in the future. Where it says Old City, just beyond that wall, is very significant. That was the city of partially of Jesus' day. A little bit of this is expanded beyond it, but we'll be looking at that. And then the New City, which is a more modern day city of Jerusalem. We'll take a brief look at that at the end today. So this is a view looking down on Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. And what we're seeing in the center of the picture is where the Temple Mount once was, and that structure in the center is called the Dome of the Rock. The temple once stood there. Beyond that, we can see the new city of Jerusalem, some of the modern high-rises over there. Now, in the foreground, what I've circled here, that is a cemetery, a very, very large cemetery, Jewish cemetery. I want to look at that in just a minute. Next slide, I think. This is a gate that is very significant, that once went exactly to the Temple Mount. It is closed today. This is a Temple Mount, and that gate was called the Golden Gate, or sometimes called the Eastern Gate. And east in the Bible always represents life, just like the sun rises from the east. It always represents life. The Messiah, Jesus, went through that gate one time, one day, and he'll be going through the gate again. Now, this is from the valley looking back up at the Mount of Olives. So we're beneath Mount of Olives looking down. That's the valley. And you can see looking right up this whole area. It looks a little bit different now than it did in Jesus' time because this very, very large cemetery, the largest and oldest Jewish cemetery in the world, is here. Because it's believed this will be the place of the resurrection of the dead. It'll take place at the end of time. Zechariah prophesied in Zechariah 14. So many of them want to be buried there. Now, this is a church on the Mount of Olives. It's called Dominus Flevit, which means the Lord wept. And this actually happened 2 times in this vicinity, 2 times that Jesus cried or wept. One of them was when he came down this mountain on Palm Sunday, and this was the week of the Passover and eventually the crucifixion and resurrection. And the people were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Okay, and they're waving palm branches. Now, Hosanna to the Son of David, really what that meant is kind of a subversive term. It meant save us from the Romans, Son of David. And reference to Son of David would be the military Messiah, the one who was going to actually take over and militarily destroy the Romans and free the city. But as this is all going on and the people are yelling, Jesus suddenly stops and he starts sobbing. Kleio in Greek means sobbing loudly in the middle of all this. And he goes on to explain why he was talking about this coming destruction eventually. And he was seeing ahead to about 70 AD when the whole city was going to be destroyed by the Romans because they didn't understand this coming. They didn't fully understand exactly why he was here this time. They had this whole idea that he was a military conquering king. So he cried. That was one of the times. He wept. He sobbed loudly. The other time was on the other side of the backside, actually, of the Mount of Olives, in a place called Bethany, a little village up there. And you can't see it from here, but it's on the backside. And that was the tomb of Lazarus. And that incident was after Lazarus had died. It had been in the tomb for a few days. Jesus showed up to the tomb, and Mary and Martha were there crying. Everyone was very sad at the loss of Lazarus. And it says that Jesus wept, but it's a different word. The cruo, a Greek word, simply means he shed tears, like a tear, just picture a tear coming down his cheek. So that's different than the other one. So what does that mean? Well, obviously Jesus knew what was going to happen here. He was going to resurrect Lazarus, but he was sad to see the sadness of these people he loved, and so he shed a tear. Now on the right, I mentioned to you before that the Jews are very big on pictures and customs. They want to visualize everything. So in ancient times, they come up with this idea of sadness at funerals when somebody dies and people are crying, to have a little tiny bottle called just like a tear bottle, and pass it around and let every person who was mourning the passing of this loved one to put a tear, one of their own tears, in that bottle. And they would do this all the way around to represent this sadness, this love for this one who was now passed. And then they would bury that tear bottle right next to that person. And this is the whole idea of shedding tears. Of course, on the Mount of Olives, Jesus ascended. And before he did, he talked a lot about what it would be like at the end of days in the account in Matthew 24. Very important chapter. And he will also come back. He will come back here. His feet will stand on the Mount of Olives again. It will split, as described in Zacharias. The Mount of Olives will. Now, in this valley, it's called the Kidron Valley, or the Valley of Jehoshaphat. There's a prophecy. Joel said, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the Valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will enter into judgment against them concerning my inheritance, my people Israel. For they scattered my people among the nations and divided my land. In other words, one day God is going to judge the people, the nations, as to how they treated Israel. And in that valley is where this is described. This judgment will take place for that specific idea. Now, just to the left, the Mount of Olives is to the right. If we go a little bit to the left, that's the Garden of Gethsemane. That church right there is called the Church of All Nations. We'll look a little closer at the Garden of Gethsemane. It's right beneath those words right there. It looks like this. These are olive trees. Olive trees are incredibly fascinating. I'm not going to have a whole presentation on this because they're so important in the Bible. They represent so many, many different things. But many of these trees are over 2,000 years old. Some of them could have been the ones that Jesus leaned against when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before the events of that time when he was crucified and eventually resurrected. And these, because olive tree roots never die. They technically never die. The tree can keep growing and growing and growing. This is called the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the word Gethsemane actually is a large stone object pictured right there. They weigh about 2,000 pounds, and they're placed on tops of sacks of olives. And they squeeze out the oil from the olives, which is very used for so many things back in those days. And it's a representation of Jesus having the weight of the sins of the world on him as he sweat drops like blood, the Bible describes. Now, here's a picture, a drawing of what we think it looked like back then. You can see the Temple Mount. We'll look at that closer in a minute, in the temple. Notice to the right, the little David city. That was original Jerusalem from 3,000 years ago. It was very small. Then we had the additions of the lower and upper city, and then eventually something called the business district. So those are the different regions of Jerusalem. Now, this particular view looks a little bit different here. You can see the Temple Mount and David City just highlighted, and that's it. So this would be Jerusalem of 3,000 years ago. And what's highlighted in yellow is across this other hill called the Western Hill. You can see that modern day Jerusalem in this area, if you remember back several slides ago. But the yellow line was a line that was expanded, I should say, by King Hezekiah. He was an incredible king of Israel back around 700 AD. He expanded it greatly into that whole area there. And by the time of Jesus, that was the extent of Jerusalem. So kind of give you a little visual as to how big it was. Okay, back to David's city. Let's look at that a little closer. Here it is. This is from an amazing model in Jerusalem behind something called the Israel Museum. This is a scale model structure of the entire city. It's really something to visit. I have many, many pictures from there. This shows you how small it was. Only 6 or 7 acres, maybe 1,200 people. I think that might even be exaggerated. David's city was very, very small. And up above it there is the Temple Mount in the far right corner. Another view of David's city, a little bit wider view. You can see the lower and upper city from this one, and you can see that's a model, looking carefully there. This is a video showing the area where David's city was in the Temple Mount.
The camera begins by looking south over the narrow ridge of Jebus and the city of David. As the clip progresses, the helicopter swings over the Kidron Valley and swoops down to view the eastern side of the ridge in the bright sunlight. The excavated areas above the road at the bottom right have revealed buildings dating to a time before David captured the city. The entrance to the Gihon Spring is located near where the bus is parked. The light brown soil of the excavations generally shows the extent of the early city. The camera then turns to show a higher hill to the north and the walls of the modern old city. Protruding above the walls is a gray dome marking the top of the hill where Solomon built the first temple. Seen clearly at this point are the whole ridge, Kidron Valley, and in the distance, the location of the Temple Mount.
That's an excellent video showing today what it looks like. I mentioned before that these are from an organization called Preserving Bible Times. They sell a series called Above Israel, and they're just great. Now I'm showing you this picture to show it looked like back in 1915. Notice you can't see anything of what we're seeing today. So in other words, all of what you're seeing now has been uncovered really in the past 100 years, that whole David City area, because Israel had been neglected, had been really forlorn. Not much had happened during this time period. So let's go back again to that David City, and I want to show you something that was really interesting. They mentioned in the video, it's something called the Spring of Gihon. It was a major water source for David's city. It also was a water source for something called the Pool of Siloam, which has big implications in the Bible. It was dug by King Hezekiah, that guy I mentioned a while ago, through the rock. Unbelievable. It was just an incredible accomplishment. He did this before the Assyrians came in to surround the city, so they had a source of water. And you can see there roughly what it looks like. This is a really cool little picture, kind of showing more the route of it going down to the Pool of Siloam. Inside, you can see the rock. They dug like this. They dug actually from two different directions. And this is called the Gihon Spring. It went into the city of David. They consider this living water because it came from a spring. Living water means water that comes directly from the hands of God. So cistern water is not considered living water. It's been sitting there. But this is actually a spring. You can actually walk through this today. It's pretty amazing. So let's look at the Temple Mount briefly, just above David City, right above it. So there it is in this drawing. We can see beyond it, see where it says Antonia Fortress. That was a Roman fort. They built it right there so they could keep an eye on everything going on in the temple, because they are very suspicious of what the Jews are doing. Solomon's colonnade was a very important place the rabbis met. It's also where the Sanhedrin met, which was the governing 70 people, 70 men who were the governing body of Israel back in those days. If you look to the right, or actually beneath Solomon's colonnade, where it says Southern Stairs, that was the entrance from David's city. Very significant area. See where it says Lower City entrance? That's from the Lower City. The Lower City would be the poorer people, where they came in to the temple area. And the Upper City entrance over there. Now, the Western Wall, the reason I put that on there, or Wailing Wall, is that was right here. That's what's left of this area today. And here's what it looks like today. You've probably heard about it. It's about 60 feet high, but 40 feet of it are beneath the ground. In other words, you go straight down 40 feet. There's tunnels going down there to see it. Massive stones that are the base of this. So it's like a 100-foot wall. What it really is, it's not a temple, it's a retaining wall. This is the most holy site in Judaism today. They put prayers in the wall and that kind of thing because it's so important to them. Because it's the closest thing they had left to the original temple. Another video, of going across the old city. We're coming across helicopter view towards that wall, the Western Wall.
Flying over the southeastern corner of the Old City, known as the Jewish Quarter, the camera closes in on the Western Wall, a place of Jewish prayer for hundreds of years. This wall is a small section of a wall that supported the Temple Mount platform. It is sacred to religiously observant Jews because it is assumed to be close to where the Holy of Holies of the temple was located.
Now, this is a diagram showing you the temple. And notice the large area Gentile court on either side of the temple itself. Actually, most of the space of the Temple Mount was designated for Gentiles, but the heart of it was only for the Jews, right? The area in the center. This is at Solomon's Colonnade, where the Sanhedrin met and where many of the rabbis taught in this area. And you can see to the right, that's the Gentile court. The court of the woman is in the foreground. The men could go through that gate to the temple, and only the priest could go inside the temple, and only the high priest could go inside the furthest inside part of the temple called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant sat, and only on one day a year. We'll be looking at all that because all this is very significant. So many Bible stories about this area. Now, kind of looking down from way up high, you can see that Dome of the Rock. That's about where the temple once stood, in that area. What I'm circling right here is actually a mosque. That's called the El Aqsa Mosque. It's a very holy site in Islam. And again, this is called the Dome of the Rock. Another video of the Temple Mount itself.
This view of the Temple Mount, with the Mount of Olives in the background, is from the northwest. The crowded old city is clearly visible. The camera then provides a close-up of the Temple Mount platform, and specifically, the gold Dome of the Rock, or, as it is sometimes called, the Mosque of Omar. This shrine, one of the most important in the Islamic world, was begun in 688 and finished in 691. Many Christians and Jews believe the structure stands where the Israelites' second temple was before its destruction by the Romans. The small dome, supported by 17 columns in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock, is called the Dome of the Chain. Its original purpose remains unclear, in spite of many legends that attempt to provide answers.
And as I mentioned, I'll be spending quite a bit of time in the future dealing with the Temple Mount and the actual temple, the history of it, significance, and all those kinds of things. This is considered the very heart of everything, the Temple Mount. It's holy to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Now, that right there is the area that is approaching the Temple Mount, and that would be one of the areas where you can see where that Western Wall was, actually, right in that particular area. No, I'm sorry. Let me back up here just a second. Let me correct that. I'm on the other side here. This is not the Western Wall. This is the Golden Gate or Eastern Gate. As I mentioned before, that's from the eastern side, and that would be the site that Jesus once entered and he will once again enter. This is what it looks like. It's all sealed right now. The actual Golden Gate of Jesus' time was actually beneath it. It's actually beneath the ground. There's a Muslim cemetery in front of it because they want to block any future Jewish Messiah from entering the temple area. They figure that would make him unclean. All right, now here's another picture. We're going to go to the lower and upper city of the old city. Today, though, we're going to look at the areas here where it says Jewish quarter, Armenian, Christian, and Muslim. It's kind of divided up into 4 parts. First, the Jewish quarter, a couple pictures. This is called the Temple Institute, and you can see all the instruments for the temple inside. One of them is outside the menorah. They're preparing for the new temple that they believe will be built, that they want to build. Actually, prophecies indicate it will be built. And inside that building, you can see incredible things. The table of showbread. They have everything ready for the temple itself. That's another whole topic we'll get into in a future date. This is in that Jewish quarter. Now, in the Jewish quarter, there's a section where you can see the time that the Romans controlled Jerusalem. Remember, I told you they renamed Israel into Palestine. That was during this Roman control. And this is actually an old cardo. one of those main routes. They had one right in the middle of Jerusalem years ago. Now, going to that western hill again, that's the Hezekiah area, and that was the extension of the city during Jesus' day. This is a wall of the Hezekiah city, a very important wall. It's called the Broad Wall. It's very huge. That he had built to fortify the city, and that actually was where this whole story of the confrontation with the Assyrians took place, right in this particular area. It's simply called Hezekiah's Wall. Part of the Jewish quarter back in Jesus' time was very wealthy, that upper city part. These are some of the homes, some of the models that they think they look like. They're fantastically wealthy people. Many of them were wealthy for the wrong reasons. They were making money as temple authorities and actually kind of at the expense of poor people, but that's another story we'll look at later. This is actually a home you can go into today. It's called a burnt house. It's one of these really wealthy homes. And one way we know was by the size and all the rooms, but also by these stone vessels. Those are very expensive. And they had those in the upper city. This is one of the places that was burned in that 70 AD fire I mentioned briefly before, when Jesus was crying about, was sobbing, seeing what was going to happen in the future. Everywhere you go, you see the IDF. They're, for the most part, young, other than the conscripted soldiers have been in for a while. But all young people serve, 18 to 21 the men, and generally 18 to 20 for the girls. So you see young people all over the place, which is the heart of the IDF, and you just get used to seeing them everywhere. The Armenian quarter is just past the Jewish quarter. A couple pictures from that area, just real quick. A couple scenes. There's one thing in particular I want to look at up there. It's called Herod's Palace, which is right here. That's where they believe it was. That's in that Armenian quarter today. Now, I'm going to do a couple circles here. This one right here is that Antonia Fortress, the one I was telling you that overlooked the temple, so they could keep track of everything going on. And the other fort or fortress is over here. And was Herod's Palace, is where it was. Now, those are going to come into play in just a minute, and there's a reason I'm showing you this. Here's the Antonia Fortress, and there's a better look of Herod's Palace. It was just incredible. Now, this is where Pilate would stay when he came into town. He would not stay with the soldiers. You can see in the distance, you can see it there. They'd stay here in this palace. And this would only be the Herod Antipas, who was a Herod of Jesus' time period, would also be here. So this is for the elites, for the people ruling the city. The Christian quarter, you can see it over there, just beyond it. The most important thing in the Christian quarter is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I've got it circled here. If you look at it a little bit closer, inside the building, it's very large. It's kind of a convoluted building. This part in the foreground is where the tomb was, and the background over there is where the cross was. Now, this is where the cross was. You walk up a few steps, and that's what you see. Now, obviously, this is all, over time, all these ornate things were built and put in this area. But there's very strong evidence to show us that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built. It is the place where everything happened, where the cross and the tomb actually were. I'll give you some evidence of that in just a minute. This large structure right here is where the tomb was. So it's a really significant place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, in the back of that tomb, right on the wall behind it, is another area in the rock cut area, which looks like this. And we're going to talk more about that in just a second, because that's significant. So just kind of hang on with that idea. Let's first go to the Muslim quarter. And Muslim quarter is kind of fun. It's very crowded. There's a lot going on, many businesses. It's actually very large. It's the largest quarter. You can see this, merchants. It's fun to, just to see these people and to talk to them and negotiate the price, which is what is done. So it's interesting. Just alive with color, alive with products. Under the city is this. There are caves or caverns underneath the city. Actually, it should be called quarries. I should call them quarries, where they dug huge stones from underneath Jerusalem, and they brought them back on top, and they used them to build the temple. Quite an amazing feat, how they did it all. Now, there's two tombs in Jerusalem that are honored is the tomb of Jesus. One of them is here. That's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The other one is there. That is sometimes called the Protestant tomb. It's kind of roughly it's called that. And the question is which is the correct tomb? So let's first go to the Protestant tomb or Protestant place. Remember in the Bible it says they're described as Golgotha. Now you can see where that kind of looks like Golgotha, the place of the skull. It really looks like it. It was discovered in the 19th century by somebody named General Gordon, and he's the first one to identify it. He said, "I think I found the tomb of Jesus." The Bible said at the place Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and there's a garden here because there's a nice big source of water here. So that made it look like a possibility. Now here's the tomb itself. And there's a little kind of a little slot there where there would have been a stone that would have rolled across to shut the tomb, to close it. And this is not from from Jerusalem. This is from another place. This is from Megiddo, near Megiddo. Another tomb which actually shows what those tombs would look like. Now, inside, it looks like this. There would simply be a place to lay the body. You can kind of see it to the left right there. This is the tomb itself. And that's a little bit closer. The garden tomb has these burial bench with that kind of a headrest. You can see it in the distance. They're a little bit hard to see. Now, is this a tomb of Jesus? Okay, it almost for sure cannot be, because this is a tomb that they used 800 years earlier during what was called the First Temple period. The Bible says Jesus was buried in a new tomb, in which one had not yet been buried. Well, this is clearly not a new tomb. This is a very, very ancient tomb. And it's not even the structure of the type of tomb that they used during Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, which we call the Second Temple, they had these boxes. You can see there's about 4 or 5 of them there. They're called ossuaries. And what would be inside of the boxes are bones. The boxes were the size of the largest bone in the body, which is a femur. And the bones are placed inside that box, and you could put members of the same family in the same box. Now, they couldn't put the bones into the box until the body had decayed. So the body would sit inside another area, one of those slot areas over there, you can see, these niches, for about a year. And it took roughly about a year for the body to deteriorate, for the flesh to be gone, and for nothing but bones to be left. And the Jews took literally the idea that the sin is in the flesh. Once the flesh is gone, then the bones are pure, and we can put them in the box, and then we can put them again back into those areas. This is what a Second Temple period burial area looked like. And it roughly was about 220 BC to 70 AD, I should say, not AC, AD. And these are a couple of these little areas going back in. Kokim, I believe they call them in Hebrew, where they actually put these ossuaries. That's Second Temple. Here's another one. And you can see all these areas. It looks very different than the tomb, the garden tomb. And what's on the right, it's an insert picture, is the tomb of Caiaphas, what they believe is Caiaphas, the high priest. And that's an ossuary. They found these ossuaries that are dated to that Second Temple period, because that's when they used them during this time period. And this is at the original, when they found this ossuary of Caiaphas, this is it right here, an actual picture of it. Right there. Now, going back to this picture again, we're going to take a look at it. Again, Hezekiah's city, Jesus' city. Okay, right about here is where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built. Now, you might say, well, how could that be? Because it's outside the walls. It's outside the walls of that time period, but not the walls today. So in other words, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is within today's walls, not outside. In that time period, they had to be built outside of the wall. Any area like that could not be within the city, had to be outside the city. Now, in this particular drawing, it kind of is angled a little bit different here. Mount Zion is kind of that western hill area. You can see the Temple Mount, see David's city, the narrow area. And if you look up here, that's where it would be. That's outside the city. And that was an area, a rocky area, a quarry area, where that church was built, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because it was discovered these tombs were the tombs of that Second Temple period. So what it probably looked like, this is that model in Jerusalem, is something like this area in here, and where they would crucify, he was crucified nearby, that would be on a road where everybody could see him, because the Romans wanted people to see the agony in somebody's face as they're dying on these horrific crosses. It was a brutal death. And it had to be on this main road. It had to be an area that kind of considered a disgusting place. There were certain conditions. And outside the city would have met that conditions easily. And if you think about it, there's even some symbolism to this whole idea of this quarry and Jesus being the cornerstone who suffered all this to build the church through him. And what I'm showing here is how the wall jogs in there. The wall jogged in there during Jesus' time. So that quarry was outside of the wall, exactly where that Church of Holy Sepulchre sits today. And there it is again. It's right over that exact area. Okay, so there were many old, I just showed you one, but there's many old quarry and ancient tombs found under the church. Many I've never seen because they're covered up, but they found all kinds of them of that Second Temple period. So it's very likely this is the place where Jesus was buried. And this is, again, that picture of that tomb. This is covering the tomb today. They actually opened this up a few years ago and went down into that tomb area and took some pictures very, very briefly. Another angle of it there. And again, that's the area behind the actual other tomb, where it's very likely where Jesus, he would have been buried in a place like that with the ossuaries put in there. Of course, we know he was not put in an ossuary because he resurrected from the dead. So his bones never went in the tomb. He resurrected. This is the western city of Jerusalem. To the right is the old city, and you can see a picture of it there on the far right. Ben Yehuda is a major street and a business area. It's a real fun area. There's restaurants outside. It's real alive. Jerusalem's a really alive city. It's a great place to walk around. The arrows I've got pointing in the middle are to the Knesset, which is their government area, be like our Congress, and the Israel Museum, which is just a fantastic museum. They have all kinds of museums, but this is the biggest one. Right behind it is where the Shrine of the Book for the Dead Sea Scrolls is, and also that big model that I mentioned that shows Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Now, here's a view of it. You can see all these mountains, all these rugged land around Jerusalem. You can see the Knesset, and you can see the Israel museums. Just a little sidelight. If you're a contractor, you don't want to be a contractor in Jerusalem. Why am I saying that? Because when people start building or start digging to set foundations for a new building, so many times under that city, under almost everywhere in the city, are ancient places, ancient tombs and ancient buildings underneath that area you're going to dig. So it's not like digging in a new area, because there's so much life underneath the existing city. So often they just have to wait until the archaeologists come in and do their thing, and it takes a long time. So it's a very interesting area, to say the least. So anyway, the Knesset and the Israel Museum, another angle of it from the airplane in this particular area, and I'm just showing you kind of the new city. This is the Shrine of the Book, where much of the Dead Sea Scrolls is housed, including the biggest one called the Isaiah Scroll. And here's that model from a distance that I mentioned before. Ben Yehuda Street, just showing you a little bit of the life of the western side of Jerusalem, the new city. Again, it's a great place to walk around. It's fun. Outside cafes, it's just alive. Looks like this. Marketplaces, fresh food everywhere. The restaurants are fantastic. And finally, just one last area I want to look at. Way on the edge of town is a museum called Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem means, it translates a place and a name. This is a place where names were trying to be remembered for all time. What names? The names of those who were killed in the Holocaust, the 6 million or so, the numbers. And they have all these different areas where the Hall of Names, for example, to never forget the names of the people. It's so significant. The Avenue of the Righteous, you've never maybe heard of that before. Those are the righteous Gentiles who did whatever they could do to save Jews. Of course, Oskar Schindler being so very, very famous. This is his tomb. His tomb is actually not in Yad Vashem. It's actually outside the old city. And if you notice the stones on there, that's a Jewish custom. That goes back to Bible times. Every one of those stones represents love for Oskar Schindler. It likely is a survivor because of Oskar Schindler. Because he saved their grandparents, they're alive. And they put a stone in there to say thank you. You know, and it's so significant to see this kinds of things. It's, again, this visual idea. The Jews are very visual people. And I think everyone understands what that means. The route that they were taken to the Holocaust. The 6,000 Jews, so many of them were on these train cars. And if you can see by the symbolism of this goes to nowhere. It falls off that broken bridge and it goes to death. That's the symbolism of it. This is a really moving museum. You walk inside, it's dark, and you start to hear noise. What you're hearing is voices of names being called out. It gets very, very dark. You have to hold a railing. I don't have pictures of the inside. And you look up in the ceiling, and you see what look like stars. But every one of those little stars, those little lights, represents a child's soul. There were 1.5 million children killed in the Holocaust. And as you walk through there, you hear the names. It's incredibly moving. It takes a while to go through it, and you have to hold onto the rail because it's dark. It represents darkness. But as they represent each particular child's name, it takes a very long time to go through 1.5 million names. It's called a Children's Memorial. All right, that's just a quick view of that part of town, and that's the end of today's contextual Bible study. Next time, I'm going to do a presentation called Rabbi Jesus. We're going to look at his teaching techniques, how he used rabbinic teaching techniques. It's really cool. So many of the stories we're going to look at in light of those techniques and those teaching tactics. And I think you're going to find it interesting. I did, because it's so significant to understanding what he's saying, even greater understanding. So thank you again for being with me on this contextual Bible study, and shalom.